structure relates to intent, and how the intent is to communicate something for the formational good, the pastoral good of the audience, and helping them become more like Jesus. Early church seems to have used Matthew's gospel as something of a discipleship manual. It was the most frequently quoted gospel in the early church fathers. So it seems to have been, in some sense, the most popular of the Gospels, and used particularly for discipleship and formational purposes. And part of what you see in this is this emphasis on the blending of teaching and action. 5 teaching sections, which may not be coincidence. Now, of course, scholars get jazzed by this, Devin, so what do they want to do? They want to find Genesis here. They want to find Leviticus here. They want to find Deuteronomy here. Well, it doesn't work at that level. It doesn't work that precisely. It's more just a very general thing. But nevertheless, I do think you can argue that there is strategic intent behind that. And so for Matthew, it's kind of this alternating back and forth between different types of material that's really characteristic of his gospel. Now in Mark, most scholars argue that Mark unfolds according to 2 major sections. And the pivot point is really at Peter's good confession and at the transfiguration. That's really the pivot point between the 2 halves of Mark's gospel. In Mark's gospel, geography is a big deal. Where does Peter's confession occur? I mean, we do that. We did this last Sunday at the Englewood, Tennessee church where I preach. I don't preach at the Englewood down here. I preach at the Englewood up there. I believe, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. Oh my God, oh my God. Okay, now where did that happen? See, in Mark, that's a big deal. Where did that happen? Caesarea Philippi is where that happened. So that's got Roman military fingerprints all over it. Roman garrison there, Caesarea as in Caesar. There are authority dynamics. There are symbols of power and authority all over this Roman military outpost. And it is precisely amidst all of this, not in the heart of Jewish territory, that Peter's confession of Christ occurs. This pivotal moment, upon this rock I will build my church. You see how that preaches to people living in Rome, surrounded by those same symbols of power and authority. Not upon that rock, upon this rock, I'll build my church. No wonder he tells Peter to put away his sword and puts Malchus's ear back on and all that kind of stuff. Because that's not how his kingdom advances. And Mark is preaching about that, if you'll pay attention to the geography. He's not making stuff up. It happened where it happened. But he's preaching from that reality, not simply giving you a historical footnote about where to find it on the map. It matters. And the fact that it is the strategic pivot point of Mark's gospel is significant because it's where the story turns. Everything is leading up to that. Everything flows from that. I'm not saying it's the most pivotal moment in history. Cross, resurrection, ascension, which in Scripture almost theologically gets compressed into one great big event. That's the pivot point of history. But the pivot point of Mark's gospel, the turning point in his sermon, is a confession of Jesus as supreme authority in a place where you're surrounded by symbols of the very authority that seems to be in control of your world. I think people who live in what is arguably still the world's most influential country would really do well to hear what Mark writes to Christians living in Rome. To people who can't imagine a world without Rome as the dominant cultural, military, and economic influence. About real power, real authority. And not only who that's found in, but how that is demonstrated. Because in Mark's gospel, Jesus is a servant warrior. He's demonstrating power in and through servanthood. Which is completely counterculture in the Roman Empire. You see what I'm saying here? How structure preaches. By making that the pivot point of the gospel, he's using literary technique to reinforce what is central and arguably the central emphasis of the sermon. How does structure preach in Luke? Luke organizes around geography. Once Jesus' ministry is launched, there are three major sections. And Luke is presenting Jesus on a journey to Jerusalem. The first stage of Luke ends chapter 9, verse 51, and Jesus set his face on Jerusalem. The end of the second section is when Jesus gets to Jerusalem. The third section is in Jerusalem. Now think about that in relationship to what you know about the structure of the book of Acts. You had Acts class. Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. Right? So what happens is, in Luke's gospel, Luke, by the way, loves the number 3. Just as one example, how many times does Paul tell the story of his conversion? 3. Sesame Street is brought to you by the number 3, according to Luke. Is Luke interested in geography? Yeah, Luke is interested in geography. So what you have in Luke's gospel is 3 stages ending in Jerusalem. So Jesus' early ministry outside of Jerusalem. Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus in Jerusalem. Now, that's not chronologically what happens. It's not one trip to Jerusalem. Jesus is in and out of Jerusalem. If you're like telling the events in chronological order, but Luke's not telling them in chronological order. He presents Jesus on a journey to Jerusalem. Everything hinges on Jerusalem. The second half of his 2-volume work the church begins in Jerusalem. Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. So we're on a journey to Jerusalem. The church is scattered from Jerusalem. And so there is a structure dealing with geographic triads that connects not only the books individually, but the books together as a 2-volume. There are all sorts of themes that interconnect here as well. But right now, I'm talking about structure. Gammy, you see what I'm saying here? That the structure of a sermon is a part of the sermon. It's not just a skeletal framework for the sermon. How you structure communicates the ideas. And the gospel writers are actually doing this. And so, if you just grab what Matthew's doing, boom, 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 he's locating something in a series of events. You take something that Mark is doing a different thing with, Luke's doing it, and you just sort of smush it all together and talk about the event. And in an effort to do everything, you're not actually getting at what any of them is. John, I talked about the feasts and festivals. There's all kinds of stuff going on. But there's 7 major miracles in the first half of John's gospel. John breaks down into chapters 1 through 12 and 13 through 21. There's 7 miracles in the first half of John. The last one is what? The resurrection of Lazarus in chapter 11. So the 7th miracle is a miracle of resurrection. Think about what you know about the number 7 in the Bible. 7th, there's a progression. And the 7th of the miracles is a resurrection of Lazarus. So then the 8th miracle in John's gospel, the one so significant that it can be placed on the opposite side of these 7, is the resurrection of Jesus. And so there, and how does John begin? John begins with creation. How many days to creation? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rest on the 7th. Right? So a lot of people even see creation parallels, creation, recreation, creation, new creation, parallels in this. And in which the 7th miracle foreshadows the miracle that brings ultimate rest, that mirrors God's rest through resurrection. So, just like in some ways, the Bible, after Genesis 1 and 2, presents us as living in this 8th day, John sort of presents us as living in the new 8th day. So what am I talking about, fellas? I'm talking about how structure preaches. Not just the content within the structures. And so the structures, the ways the different colors are used, gospel writers are all presenting Jesus in different ways. I'm just kind of setting up how important it is to take seriously how a gospel writer is presenting an event, rather than just presenting an event from Matthew in the same way that you would from Mark or whatever, or looking at the other gospels to see what details you can fill in that are missing in your account, and just sort of talking about the event as a whole. I'm setting up what we're going to talk about as we go through each of the individual categories.